And immediately from the outset, it's like my first big review, it was something like, get this musician before the hip documentary makers ruin him. And also pointing out quite early on then as well about the need to sell records. Well, it's like being a balancing act. He called me an outsider, and you want to maintain that outsider aesthetic somehow, which I wasn't quite aware of, that I was being an outsider.
Hello and welcome to Working to Work, a neurodivergent journey through employment. I'm Sam, a host of this project, and in this episode I initially intended to explore all facets of this idea or notion of outsider art, and in particular how that relates to neurodivergence, what links there are between neurodivergent people and this label of outsider art. And I chose to do this with Daniel Wilson, also known as Meadow House, who is a composer, a sound artist, and a writer who has been described as an outsider musician and was described as such very early on in their career. But as sometimes is the case, the conversation diverged from my initial intentions of a deep dive into all aspects of what it means to be kind of on the periphery of the creative world in terms of one's recognition and monetary compensation. I do want to explore in greater depth the questions I had about outsider art, and I will look to do that more in a future episode. But in this episode, Dan and I discussed the label outsider and what that means today. We touched on Dan's own story, his career trajectory. I think it's interesting to see individuals' journeys, especially atypical career paths and creative career paths, and trying to understand, okay, how were those opportunities gained? Why weren't some opportunities accessible? How that impacted one's art and one's sense of self and well-being. We spoke about Dan's unique approach to creating. And when I say unique approach, it's maybe less about how he's doing things, but the particular interests that he has, and trying to find the collaborators and ways to be able to explore those passions while making a living. And I guess a question in this episode is that working? How does one do that? And if it's not working, how one might do that. So if you have an interest in outsider art and what that term means today, and how someone who has been described as an outsider artist or musician feels about that, and how they feel it's impacted what they do and the opportunities that they are able to obtain, this is an episode for you. And also, if you're curious about Dan's work, because in this episode I've interspersed examples of the diverse range of really novel, very creative work that Dan has produced, which comes from a mind that is not necessarily thinking along conventional, well-trodden routes. It's coming from someone that's fascinated by ideas and what's come before, but building on that and imbuing his own creative ideas and aesthetic into the work. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Dan Wilson. Dan, thank you so much for making the time to do this interview. I've been looking forward to it for a long time.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Is that something that people say back to when someone says thanks for having me? You're welcome?
I always say it. I say it whenever I'm invited somewhere, which is rarely.
No, what you said made sense to me. What I said seemed an odd response. You're welcome. For those that aren't familiar with your work, can you describe what you do?
No. I'll have a go.
Please.
I do sound projects. I began with a long-running tape dropping project, which was dropping audio cassettes of homemade music in public places for random people to find. That lasted from like school days, like 1996, I suppose, to about 2004, 2005, when cassettes fell out of vogue, and I could no longer drop them and make any progress with them.
And so then being out of vogue, the reason you couldn't do it anymore was because people didn't have cassette players.
Well, people didn't have cassette players. It's a shame, because it was also the era when more people on the internet, so you could leave email addresses on the cassettes and get responses, but then at the same time, less people were able to play cassettes. So yeah, and I had a resonance show at the Hellebore show, exciting Hellebore show, which ran for a few years. Did a few more shows. I was very interested in the ideas of things that shouldn't be where they are. A radio show that shouldn't really be on the radio. But the same with the tape dropping, audio that shouldn't really exist or shouldn't. It's a case of creating a point of difference between what you might expect from this cassette with a deceptively designed sleeve graphics, and
so did you design the sleeves as well?
Yeah.
And
collaged.
the sleeves weren't necessarily representative of what was on the tapes?
No, often they were called like Fun 7, with a almost like pop type aspect to them. Some were made to look like classical music cassettes or folk singers, and I suppose I was doing a form of folk music, but it was very challenging at times and surprising. Sometimes I'd make personalised cassettes for specific people. It's a bit taboo, just to jar people out of complacency. That kind of arose from leaving cassettes in bullies' lockers at school. There was a grill on the front of some lockers where you could just push a tape through, and sometimes that would generate a lot of drama.
So what was the motivation there? Kind of subversive revenge?
Yeah, a
psychical
revenge almost, because I obviously the tapes were anonymous. Nobody really knew that. Not too many people knew that I was involved in doing sound making experiments, and it was cathartic in a way, I suppose. I think tape dropping that I was doing was an attempt to kind of connect with people that I wouldn't normally connect with, and introduce them to certain concepts they might find difficult or unintelligible.
I'm fascinated actually by the idea that you were seeking a sense of connection, potential connection with strangers.
Yeah, definitely.
Through this.
Yeah, definitely. It wasn't a hostile act. It was a hostile act at school, maybe, but certainly not in adulthood. It was more about finding connections, surprising people. Creating a point of difference is really important. It's a point where you have to freeze, assess things, and it's where exciting things happen at that point of difference. Anyway, after that, after 2005, I began researching ways to make music acoustically, electronic sounding music acoustically, which are called post-electronic music, and that's something I'm still doing at the moment with a group. I perform in Oscillatorial Binnage. We released an album just before the pandemic. It was called Agitations Post-Electronic Sounds, and that explores using found objects to make acoustic synthesizers, sound engines, using cranks, pulleys, levers, and string to produce electronic sounding music acoustically.
You've done a lot of different types of sound work as well.
Well, I've tried to push many angles, seeing which one works, and I don't think any of them work really. I've been trying to do various experiments to see what resonates most into the continuum, and a lot of the things don't work. Oh, I liked some of these sounds in here. This is post-electronics.
I don't know if that sound picked up, but hearing that, I thought, oh, Dan will love that sound.
Yeah, it's a nice sound.
I'm curious what the link is between the work that you've done. What do you think it is that links the tape dropping and, well, maybe you could just describe the Hellebore show briefly as well, so listeners have a sense of what that was.
So the Hellebore show was a radio show, and it played on the acousmatic condition of not being able to see things, and I liked misdirection. I like being playful with sound, and making a lot of DIY homemade instruments, trying to create new sounds, new sonic experiences, I suppose. I've never really been asked that, actually, what I was trying to do. I don't really know. I had a vague egotistical desire to be on like John Peel's show.
I don't want to frame your work as kind of working outside traditional artistic structures, because I know that you've done commercial work for clients where you kind of not contort what you do, but you're working to a brief to realize what they want. But fundamentally, I think that the work you do is exploring ideas that are particular interest to you.
Well, often I'm commissioned on the basis that it's slightly different. We want something a bit weird for this, is often the exact word they use, actually. And I have to then relax and just make something that comes naturally.
Is that difficult when you get told, hey, make something different?
I just kind of fall into, I'm able to, because I've got all these instruments that I've made which sound a bit unusual anyway, and sound a bit makeshift. And then I try to polish them a little bit.
Well, that's great that you've got opportunities to be able to do paid work.
More.
Well, how did those opportunities come about that you were able to?
Sympathy, really. It's, they felt sorry for me.
I don't believe that's the case. I think that they recognise your talents and want to utilise them.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. And I'm cheap.
Well, why are you cheap?
I'm a bit of a scab, actually. I try to undercut. I know that other sound designers charge more, and
why not charge what you think that?
Because I won't get work if I'm trying to be attractive proposition.
I don't believe that. I think that you have unique skills and a unique approach, and the output will be highly valuable and worth what you're paid. Why undersell yourself? Because
once you've got, I'd like to undersell myself for the first 5 jobs maybe. And then if one of them then goes viral, that's the dream, isn't it? You wish lots of people live their lives, novelists, writers, struggling, budding musicians, just this one hit. I just need to get the hit, the one breakthrough, the smash hit, the viral sensation. I was very lucky that one of my first major commissions was MTV, a very nice, kind of sympathetic and receptive and arty and clever person who worked for MTV. She messaged me email and heard something I'd done on Resonance, the Hellebore show, as I was saying, the radio show which explored tape dropping culture, the idea of dropping cassette tapes, and she commissioned me to do some idents for MTV, which is an insider thing, but at the time it was that they wanted something outsider. They wanted something sounded like it had got made of tin cans and dustbins and things. So it was a very strange situation where they wanted something a bit striking between the videos. That paid quite well, but I couldn't sustain it. I think even the production person who commissioned me ended up not working at MTV. It had a certain culture there that wasn't that wasn't nice or something.
Outsider art, for the lack of a better term, is a difficult thing to define.
Yeah.
How do you think of your work?
You unavoidably get influenced by the early your formative exposure to critics or reviewers, I suppose. My earliest kind of exposure was in a book called Bloody Amateurs, published by Unknown Public. It was in 2002. And then I got a review from the great WFMU presenter and musician Dave Mandel in the Brooklyn Row newspaper in America, which is very unusual. It was quite interesting to see how it went stateside. I think something about outsider thinking possibly resonates more into American culture than British, but I'm not sure about that. I have to investigate that. Maybe that's a research prospect for someone. But he called me an outsider musician. Even at the time, I hadn't even really thought of myself as that. And immediately from the outset, it's like my first big review. It was something like, get this musician before the hip documentary makers ruin him. And also pointing out quite early on then as well, about the need to sell records. Well, it's like being a balancing act. He called me an outsider, and you want to maintain that outsider aesthetic somehow, which I wasn't quite aware of, that I was being an outsider.
What about the music did he perceive to be outsider music, or make you an outsider musician?
I think he drew comparisons to Syd Barrett.
So it wasn't inherently something about what you were doing. It was that what you were doing had a similarity to someone else.
Yeah, that's how reviewers work.
Who had previously been described as an outsider.
Yeah. When this review was written, 2005, it was a time when outsider, that it was a definable genre. I'm not sure if it is now. It's a time sensitive designation. The word outsider. It's very fluid. It changes from year to year, from moment to moment.
Yeah, well, that sounds exciting that you got this review. How did you feel? How did you get this kind of being described as an outsider, or the music being outsider music?
I didn't mind it. I was very honoured that it even got column inches, that it got reviewed. I mean, it was nice, and it was nice of Ed Baxter to even consider it worthy of being released. I think he dealt with the kind of soliciting of reviews as well. So I was honoured because of being able to see yourself reflected in someone else's eyes.
Oh, please don't cock a snook. The eyes are good, the face is wrong. Mouth is sagging, mind is gone. Chin of tramp, the face is long. Spots the size of toes, that's just the way it grows. Everyone should know, I wish I was a garden gnome. Boys say ho ho ho, and the girls say no no no. Picking off the scabs, hear no evil, see no People take pot shots from their ivory towers at the meaners below. Got to blow the blues right out of the face. Got to give the cynics a blue-green taste. Mustn't let the mind and me go to waste. Got to blow the blues right out of the face. Oh, please don't point the finger when you're in the street. Just walk on over to me and pick the scabs off meat. Mina sing a happy song for everyone's mood. Blister finger verbal abuse from whinging don't know who's. Gotta blow the blues right out of the face. Gotta give the cynics a blue-green taste. Mustn't let the mind and the ego to waste. Gotta blow the blues right out of the face. When happiness is mine, I'll smile all the time. Until that day arrives, I'll just be wretched.
Do you feel like an outsider? Do you feel that your music is... And we still haven't got to defining this term yet.
Well, that's a whole different thing, defining it. But I was pleased to be recognised as being something different, which I suppose being an outsider musician is associated with.
We've talked maybe a bit about how you personally relate to it, in the sense that you feel, from what I'm understanding, is that is reflective of how you feel and how you perceive the music to be not of the kind of conventional.
It's nice my whole thing, I love creating a point of difference, and I think that's what also is possibly the whole secret of life itself, is to create a point of difference. I know a lot of the term othering is used a bit now, and it's not necessarily healthy to do that habitually.
But othering is generally doing it to someone else, right? So like to make them feel that they're not part of a group.
No, I think it says more about yourself. To others, something is actually it tells you more about yourself.
I don't understand. Can you give an example?
Well, it's to create a point of difference. Then is an educational experience, because you're assimilating the differences between one thing and another thing, and the whole process is to actually to understand it. Understand, that's the word I'm looking for.
It's a tricky subject to get into, but I think to take on this idea of being an outsider it's like any identity, where there's something that kind of feels empowering, and you feel a part of some kind of small collective or large collective, but also by virtue of kind of adopting that term, I think others that are not a part of that group and excluded effectively.
I think there's a better term, outlier, because outliers can't really communicate to each other in a way. It's like the outsider musicians, or like all the ones explored in that book by Erwin Chussid, Songs in the Key of C, said they never all corresponded with each other. I'm not even sure
they
if
weren't a kind of outsiders musician meetup.
Yeah, no, they never. I don't think they even listened to each other's music. It's like
maybe could relate to it necessarily.
Exactly,
beyond that. Yeah. This was something that is outside of the mainstream.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think a lot of the musicians there were probably listening to like Celine Dion, or, a mainstream David Bowie or something. And David Bowie would be an interesting study of outsiderdom, actually, because he was creating a point of difference, and I think it inspired a lot of people in the 20th century.
Well, you and I talk about this a lot privately, though. I'm talking to you about kind of pop music a lot, and I have listened to a lot of pop music, but maybe some other, what could be termed outsider artists or outsider creatives could relate to this, that you take in that influence, but what when it's channeled through your sensibilities and either kind of lack of or differing approach to producing something kind of quite different comes out, even if for example Daniel Johnson's intention was to write a Beatles songs, right? Something quite different comes out by virtue of their life experiences, the limitations or the different strengths of their creative ability, and that I find quite fascinating.
Yeah, well, that you've put it better than I could explain it. That's it's a filtering process, and the less also, I think sometimes there are no influences sometimes in certain musics, and you just get the pure character of the musician reflected in the music, which makes it extremely characterful, and that's the kind of music that you might define as being outsider music. And it's not so relevant now because I think musicians can change from day to day and all take influences and styles from different places.
How does this relate to outsider musicians?
Well, it almost makes we're all outsiders now, and it's a case of just who makes the loudest noise on social media platforms. It's a dangerous state we're in, actually, if we are to take seriously a warning given in 1972 by Daphne Oram, who was herself a bit of an outsider in the 70s. She set up the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which is quite an insider thing, but she wasn't listened to. She hit a lot of obstacles there. She wanted to establish an electronic music studio and got frustrated and left to form her own studio in Kent. And she wrote a book in 1972 called An Individual Note of Music, Sound and Electronics, where she employs a term, mismatched impedance, taking the sound engineering lingo to mean something more metaphorical or metaphysical even, where your enthusiasm and energy doesn't find a correct outlet and it gets clipped and distorted. The mismatched impedance is an analogy between like a microphone and a piece of hardware that you're plugging into, and it means that you get distorted, and the distortion of your energy can lead to insanity. It can have psychological implications.
I'm thinking about grounding it in the experience of a neurodivergent musician that is producing music that believes in their kind of creative ability and feels that these songs or music or however their creative ideas are being represented are valuable but not being kind of recognized and received. Are you saying that
it then affects the music? There's a feedback loop.
I've always thought about this in terms of my own music. It's all for the last 20 years, the songs have been quite sad. A lot of them are kind of unpacking difficult emotions.
Is this your Kalu music?
This is my Kalu music, and I thought about this maybe like 15 years ago. Like, why am I not writing kind of this upbeat pop party in the USA? And then I realized, well, that's not what I'm feeling. You could.
Is it the lack of recognition that's feeding into that and then creating this tone of?
No, I think it's just the struggles of life are the thing that feels more applicable to write about. But it doesn't. It's not a conscious thing when I'm creating. I'm not creating to create something that is dealing with challenging emotions. It's just what organically comes out. If tasked in a job to write a song, you
have to force yourself.
I think I'd be able to do that. But with writing for myself, this is what organically comes out. And I guess what I'm saying is, what is a chicken and egg situation?
No, it's I can see what you mean. It is chicken and egg, I think, because you don't know what comes first. I mean, is it the becoming more of an outsider affects the music being received in a way that you hoped it would, and those distortion. I mean, this is the mismatched impedance that Daphne Oram was talking about. It's the distortion of the original signal that you're trying to, and it rebounds on your original impulse. There's no outlets, and it creates frustration, and then the frustration.
What are the conventional outlets that one might have? Like, are you talking in terms of how these people socialise and feeling a kind of?
You think they just get some monetary value for you know if you can't live anymore, which I'm now existing on like a minus budget often because I did bin diving for a long time. A lot of the instruments, even in 2005, were made from recycled things.
out of necessity,
Out of
in terms of
necessity.
you couldn't afford to buy.
I think I'm safe in saying now that the microphone I used for the album was stolen by a classmate called Pav.
I've got an interest in this topic because I perceive that there's a quite a strong link between what's now termed neurodivergence and outsider art, in that ultimately, like, prior to this notion of neurodiversity, people with the conditions that fall under the neurodiversity umbrella they're all seen as disorders, mental disorders, that are people that are mentally ill, effectively.
Yeah,
And outsider art, historically, when we can get onto kind of its origins and the original terms, is art that comes from, whether it be visual art or music, that comes from people that are experiencing mental ill health in institutions. So, and potentially those people had conditions that we would now term as neurodivergent. So that link to me is really interesting. Are we talking about outsider art, or are we talking about neurodivergent art? And I think there's an overlap there.
I don't trust the origin story, but the way it goes is in 1972, the Cambridge scholar Roger Cardinal published a book, Outsider Art, which examined or repackaged even some of the ideas originally floating around in 1920s by Prinzhorn, who was a German who wrote a book in 1921 or 22, I can't remember, on artistry of the mentally ill. And the term outsider art wasn't used in that book. It was an examination of certain artists. Wolfley was one of them, who habitually produced very distinctive and striking and unusual at the time, relatively, artworks.
This is visual art.
Visual art, and that was kind of synthesized into this whole term outsider art in 1972 by Roger Cardinal, coincidentally the same year that Daphne Oram did Individual Note of Music. So there's a kind of link there between the art of the mentally ill and outsider art.
What's the link to this term art brut then, which is kind of raw art, I think, the French for?
That was Jean Dubuffet's term, I think.
How does that link into this timeline?
Well, I think it could be translated as raw art, which is quite a good term because it's almost channels the character. You're like it's a raw conduit to the person who's creating it. So you're seeing quite unfiltered expressions, very characterful expressions.
Does that mean there's a certain aesthetic to what we potentially could term as outsider art, that it should not be too overly produced?
The point is that the Roger Cardinal designation has eclipsed everything now. So outsider art has a certain aesthetic which is based on these labels that he's created. They embrace the artistry of the neurodivergent, but I think the term, I always like to look sideways. I don't trust the kind of overarching narratives of things. And if you do a little bit of digging, there's a Daily Express article from 1929 which actually used the term outsider artist. It was Alfred Egerton Cooper who used the term outsider artist to refer to someone who wasn't trained by the Royal Academy. So he's using it in the sense of someone who's not in this, what was then a very elitist, snobbish system.
So at that point, it was not to do with someone's mental
not necessarily
well-being.
No, it was like a literal term of it. I just wanted to show that the term is loose. The term reappears in different contexts, and the Roger Cardinal definition isn't necessarily the be all and end all of outsider.
Yeah, and for listeners, I mean, I'm not particularly wedded to this term outsider art. I'm more interested in the challenges, those that could be termed as outsiders.
I would say
experience
not challenges, but difficulties.
Yeah, okay.
It's the frictions that arise in the difficulties, and that creates this outsider frisson, you could say. The frictions of the individual against what was like an overarching style.
My sense is that one is potentially an outsider. I'm not interested in necessarily defining it, the term, but like if one's art is expressing a novel perspective that doesn't resonate with the wider mainstream and is not being adopted by them, and thus they are not being able to support themselves through their creative work or kind of see it validated. I imagine that there's very few artists that would be worried about losing that term being applied to them if the trade-off was that their work is recognized and appreciated, and they also are able to be compensated for that work and able to have a higher standard of living. I think if we look at probably the majority of people who have been defined as outsider artists, they haven't had a great quality of life. If it's a term that has a kind of cool cachet applied to it, and they're reaping that's just art, and that's great. And in some senses, like the term neurodivergent and neurodiversity as a paradigm, while useful bridging terms, and similarly with outsider art, a useful term to at least elevate and lift those artists that are struggling in the short term, ideally, it's all just art. And it's all just people, and it's just a different perspective and a different type of art, and it doesn't need either that classification as autistic or ADHD or outsider to be able to be recognised and appreciated and valued.
I think in the future, like people might even, if someone's listening to this in the future, even 10 years from now, the words we're using at the moment we're not even fully aware of could be very offensive. I suspect that the term outsider would become offensive at some point. Although it's convenient at the moment to define certain styles of music from certain eras, or art even, but it's something that could easily become quite negatively loaded.
In some ways, if someone is being described as outsider art, it means they're getting some type of attention, and that someone is actually even conscious of their work. It makes you wonder
who's describing it, who's calling them outsiders as well.
I guess what I'm saying is, if it's useful in the short term to raise their profile and to have a sense of recognition, then it's not wholly detrimental, in the same way that it's, from my perspective, not ideal to need to have these kind of diagnoses or this terminology of neurodiversity, except to demonstrate on a wider scale that there are different ways of thinking, behaving, communicating, and eventually as that idea that this range of experience or creative output exists, it can be melded in. So I agree with you. I can foresee a time when outsider art and neurodivergent are become redundant terms, more than offensive necessarily.
There's something almost a bit disintegrating or about deconstructing your own stuff as a perspective, as an outsider perspective.
What makes us who we are? Could you have a more important? And we're going to answer that it's a combination of socialisation, whatever that means, culture, whatever that means, and the mass media. So firstly, on to socialisation. What is citizenship to start with? Citizenship is about participation. Why have the government introduced it? That's integrated. And secondly, to get you thinking about society.
When I was young, my father father said, son, I have something to say. What he told me I'll never forget until my dying days. He said, son, you're a bachelor boy, and that's the way to stay. Son, you'll be...
So many artists who diverge from mainstream norms struggle to sustain a career while staying true to their work. You've talked about that, you know, sometimes you're commissioned to do something and you'll work to a brief.
Yeah.
How have you balanced that tension, doing work that is interesting to you and then work that pays, and how do you find that work? How do you obtain it?
I don't. It comes to I often get asked. I have just 2 or 3 regular people who commission me.
So how did you kind of obtain those regular
one of them I just
clients?
sold a book to. I try and sell books. I sell books to people sometimes, and actually there's 2 of them. There was 2 incidents of people that said, "Oh, you do music." I've got a friend who works in radio or film, and they want some beds, sonic beds, or some backdrop music or title music, jingles.
So do you feel fortunate in that sense that you like circumstances have meant that you've like met the people that actually can be kind of patrons of
I've
sorts?
not physically met them. They're all online actually, but I think since the lockdown, since the pandemic, there's been a shift in movement between, I don't know what's happened, maybe it's AI as well, but people are often now self-sufficient. They don't need me to do music for them anymore. And some producers even make their own music. They use AI systems like Suno to generate their own jingles. So I'm in a dying field. I'm in a it's not a
But do you think that AI and these platforms can create the type of work that you do, or do you think that they can synthesize ideas that are more conventional because that's where they're drawing from, and actually those doing something a bit outside the norm have a leg up? Because
possibly, I mean, the more I like to think there's a future in going more and more unorthodox in terms of instrumentation. There's a future in homemade instruments. I think those are the ways to outmaneuver AI. Any hollow object can act as a resonant filter, and acoustically coupling objects together creates cross-interactions between objects. It's possible to create acoustic modular synthesizers using junk. The challenge of post-electronic music is finding the mechanical equivalents of electronic processes, and this is something I've been doing for nearly 20 years. After many live events and group workshops over the years, and experiments with pneumatic and even hydraulic power, it became clear that electromagnetic force fields was the ideal way to sustain vibration in objects. In electronic music, there's the ADSR envelope. This is where attack, decay, sustain, and release are mapped out. To transfer this to the acoustic world may seem very simple. Attack can be done percussively, and decay and release can be achieved by choice of resonant objects or muffling or damping the object. But how can sustain be implemented? It's here that feedback force fields can be used to make objects vibrate acoustically at their own natural frequencies, powered by either bicycle pedals or solar power. The control mechanisms of post-electronic devices involve moderating the coupling between objects, controlling distance, those delicate points between touching and not touching. Processes that would normally be separate from each other in electronic sound making, such as filtering, distortion and reverb and so on, they all become interlinked in the physical world. One adjustment intended to control filtering, for instance, may lead to an unintended side effect elsewhere.
What kind of support do you think artists working outside the traditional frameworks would benefit from but don't receive?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not in a position to even answer that. I have to kind of imagine.
Is that because you feel that
I'm not getting enough work anyway, so I can't can't even make music anymore because of the lack of space and resources. There's a minus budget where you actually stop. You can't actually produce anymore. I think that's also a thing that producers...
So why do you feel you're not able to generate the amount of money that could provide you with the space to make what you feel you want to make?
Why do I think I can't make the money?
Yeah, well, why? You said you've got clients, so you're making it sound like you're fine.
Those clients are also, making challenging stuff, actually. So that's why they commission me, because they know I make quite challenging music, I suppose.
Okay, but they're not in a position to kind of
they can pay me
compensate.
A bit. They're getting funding
level.
from like arts funding from somewhere, maybe government funding, I don't know, bursaries and things. So it's all trickling down, maybe to use the Thatcher term. Is that a Thatcher term?
What do you feel that you need then to be able to have the space and to generate the amount of money to have the conditions that will allow you to make what you want and to not feel that you're limited by your circumstances?
Well, I can't answer it, because if I knew that, I'd do it and pursue those solutions. But the people that commission me, they need to get the funding, which they can't anymore. They're not getting Arts Council funding. There's the money tree is gone.
Well, do you think you would benefit from funded?
Yeah.
What would you offer in exchange for that funding?
I've got screenplays, got ideas for films. I sent them to Joe Walker, who is a Hollywood editor. He edited the Blade Runner sequel.
And why do you feel that these ideas are not being picked up?
I don't know. If I knew, I'd make ideas did get picked up.
Okay. So there's nothing like systemic really that beyond funding that you think?
It's systemic normieism. Can I say that?
My sense is that you have a lot of ideas and a lot of things that you want to realise, but there's a struggle to actually get the funding to do it, or to have people who kind of like recognise really what you're putting out there and its value. And then also beyond the kind of creative validation, there's a challenge in terms of that it's not being recognised, commissioned, valued. It's not being monetarily valued. What impact does that have on your sense of self, on your mental well-being?
I think as I get older, I feel like I'm losing time, and when I've spent a lot of time working on something, I'd like to get some payment for it, because time is of the essence. And at first, I thought it's because I didn't have the technology, I didn't have the computers. A very good friend, Salim, who also, by the way, was responsible for the earliest Resonance podcasts, actually, Hooting Yard and others, the earliest podcasts for Resonance. He gave me, he's a technologist, he's very techie, and he gave me a brilliant computer, had the tools then to create things, do music. I could spend weeks working on sound textures, songs, writing. More often I'm doing writing now, and that's becoming even more difficult to get avenues in writing.
Am I right in thinking you're writing some proposal is about kind of what could be termed outsider literature?
Yeah, I like writing about music. I like writing about outliers, outsiders, esoteric things. I do reviews of things, so occasionally review bands and people that use different tuning systems.
And touching on the tuning systems, one of the projects that you have done was about kind of microtonal sound. This is the touchstone of outsiderdom, actually, if you want to. Well, this was a project, from my understanding, where you did get some funding to be able to realise a project. So how did you feel then? Or I mean, that's an idea that you had, something you wanted to explore, to research, to produce, that was recognised by a funding body who allowed you to help facilitate you to do it. How did that work out? Like, how were you able in that instance? What was different from different other circumstances that meant that they did recognise what you were looking to do?
I was very lucky because it was actually an artist in residency here at Resonance, and I knew Chris Weaver. We were playing a group with him, Oscillatorial Binnage, and Ed Baxter I know quite well. And he's been Ed Baxter put out Tongue Under a Ton of 9 Volters.
Are you saying that opportunity really only came through
nepotism?
Well, yeah, through knowing someone. I mean, that's it kind of was, I think.
So
in that instance, having those connections was what facilitated that opportunity. How does that feel? Is that disappointing to you that that's what was necessary?
No. I just was thankful that those conditions existed to get this idea, which I believe to be very original, very new, hadn't been tried before, had been proposed by the Delaware laboratories in the 1940s, but hadn't been done before. And I was able to finally get this idea off the ground. It was produced beautifully by Sub Rosa Records, had a monograph, a booklet with it, which I didn't expect to be able to do because I really wanted like some material to go with it. It's quite humorous. It's got a kind of research integrity to it. I saw it as almost like a scholarly project, but it's got a playfulness to it too, and it even features a rare recording from the original.
Okay, let's hear something from Radionics Radio.
Under the glare of two original Delaware color scopes, the performances in this video demonstrate the various ways of sounding out radionic thought frequencies, ranging from pure tone diffusions to sequenced pieces composed from the unique musical scales that can be derived from sets of thought frequencies.
Looking back on your journey, what's one thing that you've learned that you wish you knew kind of earlier on when you were getting started?
I'd love to go back in time and just redo everything. I'd actually retrain. I wouldn't be on this timeline. I wouldn't even be here. I'd be
Why?
Plumbing or something like that.
Why?
Because it's not as useful as it could be.
Useful in what sense?
It's not. I suppose actually, it's good to create stuff. I'd always encourage people to create stuff. If you're doing historical research, you look at the census returns, and you look at your relative. It says draper, a cloth merchant, housewife, private means, cab driver. And you wonder, what did these people do? You Google their names. Did they write anything? No. Did they have any court appearances, any scandals, any dramas in newspapers? No, nothing. They're just a name on the census records. If you've got something interesting that you've made, it gives a much more, suddenly it comes alive. I found a book recently. It's called Granny Gray Remembers. It's by a lady called Marion Gray. Stay with me, I'm going somewhere. Marion Gray wrote this book, Granny Gray Remembers. No library in the world holds it, by the way. It's printed by Charles Ulyat in Chesterfield, using a very cheap printing press. Suddenly, this person's life that on the census just says housewife, her life comes alive. You've got the whole backstory of her life. She created that book in her old age, and she's illustrated what she was up to. She's added some poetry that she made. There's a record of her existence.
Dan, it's been fantastic to talk to you.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So with this episode, I'm not sure whether there is a clear takeaway or takeaways plural to offer. Maybe similar to Dan, I'm not a massive fan of labels. I think there are aspects that can be helpful, but aligning oneself with amorphous, is that the word? Or vague descriptors doesn't necessarily benefit the individual, but at times it can. In a future episode, as I mentioned at the beginning, I want to explore peripheral neurodivergent art, and using the term outsider artist or musician is kind of like a label of convenience. So do look out for that. Instead of the normal outro music for this episode, I wanted to play out with one of my favorite pieces of Dan's. This is from Radionics Radio, and it has quite a difficult title, so let me see if I can remember it. It's "Peter, please send me the money to fix the boat you promised." I might be slightly off there, but I think that's close enough. So thank you again for listening, watching, subscribing, liking, sharing, commenting, engaging. That is what I would love the most and would mean a lot to me. So I'd love to hear from you and what you think of these episodes and what thoughts you had about this conversation. Enough rambling from me. Here's the piece from Radionics Radio. See you next time.